Well, I think it would be a really serious mistake to blame nationalism alone for the rise of maritime disputes in East Asia. I think that there are other factors, both geostrategic and geoeconomic, which are playing a role. But just as it would be foolish to overlook nationalism and the impact that nationalism is having on exacerbating the kinds of problems that we're having, you've got to include it. It would be foolish to ignore it. Now, I'll say a little bit about the other factors as well, because I want to explain how nationalism filters into the other kinds of problems that we're having. And the other factors, there are these two other sets of factors or causes for this. One is geostrategic and one is geoeconomic. As you point out, the geopolitical one has a lot to do with the rise of Chinese power, and in particular Chinese naval power. The maritime disputes have a lot of history. Some of them are quite ancient. But after 1945, these kinds of disputes were put in certain kinds of limits by the U.S. naval dominance in the region. You did have naval clashes, 1950s, early 1950s, between Japan and Korea over Dokdo, Takeshima, more seriously between China, mainland China, and Vietnam over the Paracels and the Spratlys. But these clashes on the whole were relatively controlled, and no other power had the ability and to a certain extent the interest to push these kinds of disputes any further. Since 1996, however, in the first crisis over Taiwan, the Taiwan election crisis in 1996, China has been really pouring its resources into naval modernization. They have every right to do so. If I were a Chinese defense planner, I would want to do the same thing. They have good legitimate reasons, but nonetheless it has certain implications, and the rise of Chinese naval capabilities is alarming to the United States, in particular the increase of its A2AD, anti-access area denial capabilities, is alarming to U.S. defense planners and to that of allies as well. And naturally the U.S. is responding to this. And at the same time we're seeing China more assertively pursuing some of its claims in the region, notably in the East China Seas, and especially with respect to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, as well as in the South China Seas more recently with respect to the Spratly Islands. So there is a geopolitical angle here, and that's very important to recognize. The other set of factors, of course, is geoeconomic, and the other set of factors is geoeconomic in nature. As the region grows, there is a increasing demand for the resources, maritime resources, fishing, but more importantly, oil and gas. And at the same time, the set of rules which exist internationally for demarcating boundaries, maritime boundaries, and for setting up cooperative arrangements to harvest and tap those resources is terribly flawed. UNCLOS is really a screaming nightmare if you've ever looked at it. I think most lawyers, it's virtually a kind of permanent employment act for lawyers, and experts who look at it will agree. They're all things, such vaguely defined concepts such as historical use of islands, archipelagic waters. There's ways of, under international law, the way you demonstrate your claim to an area involves exercising control. That means sending ships to the area, making diplomatic démarches, protests. So it's really, a recipe for disaster, or a recipe for conflict. So you've got these other geoeconomic and geostrategic factors which are at play. Now, the point which I want to make with regard to nationalism is that these geostrategic and these geoeconomic factors alone should not be insoluble. If you look at the sort of geostrategic side of things, while these areas are important, they're not worth going to war for, on the whole. And there are ways of entering into strategic dialogue, drawing up zones of influence and so forth, well known to realist scholars, if I may use or refer to the vernacular of international relations for a minute, which have existed for ages. And the kind of games that we're beginning to play in the South China Seas, games of sort of brinkmanship, playing chicken in the China Seas, really raises the possibility for very, very dangerous kinds of clashes. So, it shouldn't. Clashes which really I do not think are justified in terms of the strategic importance of those maritime features alone. In addition to that, I think it's even more clear with regard to the geoeconomic arguments, that these should be problems which are soluble. We've seen, by the way, even in recent years, successful efforts to do joint development of areas. The fishery agreements that we've seen between China and Vietnam, between Japan and Korea. And I also would add that there's a big tendency in the press to exaggerate the importance, the economic importance of these resources. I mean, in a world where oil markets and gas markets, global oil market and gas markets are functioning, it really shouldn't matter in the larger macroeconomic scheme of things who has control of these resources. So by themselves, I think these geoeconomic, geostrategic factors should not be causing as serious disputes as we're having. I think the if you like, geocultural factors, that is the rise of nationalism in the region, which is fueled by a number of different factors, is hugely complicating the diplomatic efforts to deal with these issues. It just becomes very difficult for policymakers to compromise on these kinds of issues, and it increases the volatility, the possibility that some commander in the field will take actions which are not approved of, is very real. And I think that this kind of nationalism is a factor that you cannot overlook when you take a look at this particular situation. So again, I very much feel that nationalism is a factor, but you have to take a look at a number of different factors. Now, if you want to ask me where this nationalism, why do we have this rise in nationalism, or this particular manifestation of nationalism, that's another set of questions. Let me begin with the sort of strategic issue which is involved here. The US has obviously alliances with a number of countries in the region: Japan, Philippines, South Korea, and Australia, and has various kinds of partnerships, strategic partnerships in addition to that. Now, in every alliance, there is a problem. It's referred to by experts and scholars as the alliance dilemma. On the one hand, there is always the fear that your allies are going to drag you into some crazy fight in which you have no interest in. It's the so-called problem of entanglement. On the other side, there is the equally complex and real fear that when push comes to shove and you find yourself in a fight, your ally will abandon you, that they will not be there to help you out. Yeah? And both of these are there all the time. And both of these problems are very much involved with these maritime disputes. The United States is very much concerned that these, now especially against the background of rising Chinese naval power, but not only Chinese naval power, but that disputes over maritime issues will lead to conflicts in which allies look to the United States to help them out, and if we respond, we may find ourselves in an escalating conflict, which we would really prefer not to do that. And even if the United States government, I mean, there are people, by the way, in the US government who view the maritime disputes as an opportunity, yeah, a chance for strengthening our alliance relationships, forging new partnerships, and so forth. But, even if we wanted to do that, we would find it very hard afterwards to justify that kind of escalation to the American people. So it's really not a sustainable policy. So we've, on the one hand, we've got this problem of entrapment, which is potentially existing with these maritime disputes. On the other hand, if we fail to back up our allies, right, and they find themselves in a situation where they are being militarily confronted and the US doesn't help out, well, their feeling of abandonment will be very real, and that might very well lead to a breakdown of the alliance. Now, this is no problem. We've had this for a while, yeah, in different cases. But as the maritime disputes increase, this problem is increasing. Yeah, and how does the US deal with it? And I think there's a little bit more, in a very general sense, there's a little bit more continuity in the US approach than I think your question, as you originally posed it, assumes. The US basically tends to adopt a position of strategic ambiguity. Now, the US always takes, as in general, taken the position that it does not support one country's claim to sovereignty over against another's. This is an issue in the end which the disputants themselves have to resolve. Yeah? At the same time, however, the US insists that any resolution of these issues, and here there's a certain kind of analogy with the strategic ambiguity that we exercise with regard to the Taiwan question, but we insist that any resolution of this crisis be peaceful, be done by peaceful means, and consistent with international law. Yeah? Now, what that basically means is that if, for example, a US ally, say the Philippines, decides to start a fight with the People's Republic of China, fires upon Chinese ships, the United States would view that as a useless provocation of China and would not feel obligated to support its ally. On the other hand, if you had an attack on the ally, the US would respond. Now, this position of neutrality, US insisted it adopts a position of neutrality vis-a-vis countries, and here there's some differentiation. We can be strictly neutral, or we can be more forward-leaning in terms of the kind of position that we adopt. And so, for example, as you point out, we have a different stance on the Spratlys than we've had on the Senkaku Diaoyudai or the Northern Territories between Japan and Russia, the Northern Territories, Southern Kuril Islands dispute. With regard to the Kuril Islands and more importantly with regard to the Senkaku Diaoyudai position, we've always insisted, and this we are bound by, in fact, certain treaty obligations, that territories which are under Japanese administration are covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty. Yeah, the Mutual Security Treaty of 1960. And the United States occupied the Senkaku Diaoyudai Islands for much of the Cold War, half of the Cold War, returned the island control of, this was part of the reversion of Okinawa in 1972, and under the Treaty of the Reversion of Okinawa, we also transferred the administrative control of Senkaku Diaoyudai Islands to China. I know this sounds a little bit legalistic, but these legalistic finities actually make a difference. And it is because of this and that more recent, both Secretary of Defense Gates, Panetta's predecessor, as well as Secretary of State Clinton, said that the United States, in fact, has to be forward-leaning in terms of defending those islands. But that's also a reflection, I think, in some ways of the importance of Japan in this issue. But this position, I want to go a little bit further, this position of sort of neutrality and of strategic ambiguity may not prove sustainable in the future. As we have continued military buildup in the region, both on the side of China and the United States and its allies, the potential for conflict increases, the pressures, the potential for escalation increases, and the need for having some kind of clarification of these issues increases as well. And I really think that we need to have some kind of strategic dialogue, including the allies, but with the People's Republic of China in order to address these questions. There's a certain analogy you could make with the Cold War. During the Cold War in Europe, we had a major territorial dispute, that is the status of East versus West Germany. But after 1961, that boundary between East and West Germany, with the building of the Iron Curtain, the erection of the Berlin Wall, became stabilized. It took two very nasty and dangerous crises to do that, but we had a stabilization for the rest of the Cold War, which helped prevent the possibility of clashes. One of the problems we have in East Asia right now with respect to the maritime boundaries is that there is no such clarity and there's no such tacit agreement. And that's one of the reasons why I think we really need to pay attention to this. It's very important, I think, to emphasize to the Chinese in particular that the United States really is not looking to stem the rise of China. If you just take a look at the long picture, the big picture of the last 100 years of American policy to East Asia. I mean, while we've had conflicts with China, the United States has as often been helping China as it's been fighting against it. And while there may be some people in different aspects of the different areas of the American government and the areas of American sort of intellectual community which deals with security issues who believe that America needs to and absolutely must continue its hegemony at all costs, I think when push comes to shove, there's a lot of room, and I would add this is also true of Mitt Romney, the current Republican candidate for presidency. if push comes to shove, there's a lot of room for accommodating and desire to accommodate China and to avoid a conflict. There's no appetite whatsoever to do so. But what we do have, and I don't think there's any appetite on the Chinese side either. I mean, while there is a nationalist current in China, there is a sense of nationalism centered upon this story, the historical narrative of the century of humiliation, where China was knocked out of its rightful place in the international and regional hierarchy, which it's now trying to regard. While there's certainly no shortage of paranoia, either in China or in the United States, Beijing or in Washington, I don't think on the whole that either country, and China wants to go into a clash either with the United States or seek confrontation with the United States. China has, and the United States, but I think China even more so than the United States, has huge internal problems which it has to deal with: political, cultural, economical, environmental, and so forth. And these things really are a distraction. I think that sober policymakers on both sides, when they take a look at these issues carefully, and I think this issue has been very much highlighted even in the last few weeks with the Shangri-La meetings and so forth, that they will realize that we do need to work out ways of accommodating each other. And this goes, one of the things which this goes back to what I was saying earlier, is we need to understand this problem as being multidimensional. That is, in order to try to avoid these kinds of conflicts becoming unmanageable, we can't just look at this through a kind of classical realpolitik balance of power issue. Because if you do so, you ignore the other factors, the economic factors, the geoeconomic factors, and the geocultural factors. I think we need to be attentive to the balance of power. We need to manage the balance of power and potential military clashes in such a way we don't have conflict. If I can be pedantic for a second, and I'm a professor, so what do? We've got the right to be a little bit pedantic. I'll quote Vegetius, one of the great Roman strategists. If you wish peace, prepare for war, right? Si vis pacem parabellum is, I think, actually, I don't speak Latin, but my son studies it and my daughter studied it, so maybe they can correct me. In any case, you've got to be realistic about this in order to avoid conflict. At the same time, you've got to do something about dealing with the frailty and the weakness of the international regime, the UNCLOS regime, and find ways in which countries can meet their growing economic and needs by creating ways of both demarcating boundaries more clearly and also setting up joint development projects on a bilateral and possibly, certainly necessarily in the South China Sea's multilateral basis. And finally, I think it would be very foolish to ignore the way in which nationalistic politics in all of these different countries, might even include the United States on this score, feeds into these conflicts. And here we have sort of two options. At a minimum, we have to try to contain these kinds of passions. Try to, as much as possible, take these issues off the political agenda. When you have, and certainly in democratic societies, we can't order people to shut up. That's sometimes something which China, for example, finds hard to understand when senior politicians in Japan or elsewhere make some kind of nationalistic statement. They see this as being a reflection of the central government. But while we can't prevent politicians, opinion leaders, and so forth from making those kinds of statements, at a minimum, governments need to take a stance saying we're not supporting that. And there needs to be a certain degree of leadership exercised when we have these kinds of issues. And there are a whole set of rules, ways of dealing with these issues which exist, which can contain nationalist passions. However, under certain circumstances, when the conditions are right, we can go further. We can try to pursue, and this is a much overused word, but we can try to pursue reconciliation. See, the nationalist passions which have emerged over the territorial issues is part of a larger phenomena, which also we see reflected in the sort of recent disputes over history in East Asia. This has been something which has really resurfaced since I'd say at least began in the early 1980s and took off in the post-Cold War period. The pluralization of politics, that is the expansion of space in the sort of public sphere for discussing historical issues, expanded enormously in China, certainly in Korea. Groups like the Comfort Women, victims groups who used to be shut up, now spoke up. The spread of human rights norms helped legitimate their speaking up. And by the way, interestingly enough, increased economic penetration gave those kinds of groups greater leverage. That is, they can threaten boycotts, they can, not just economic, but also just social and political interdependence allows these groups to exercise influence in Japan, in Korea, in a way that was not true in the past. And so as a result, you had this sort of escalation of victim-based centered nationalism in the 1980s and 90s. There were other factors, but especially in the 1990s and early 2000s. And in many ways, while that particular storm over historical issues has passed us for now, it has found a new focus in these territorial issues. And in many ways, some of the ways in which politicians in the Philippines, in China, in Japan are talking about these issues is terribly, and it's often the same characters, terribly reminiscent of the debates over history. And if, however, the conditions are right, and that is that there's a sort of readiness on both sides of these different kinds of issues to pursue a path of reconciliation, which means not simply saying, I'm sorry, an apology, but also means pushing issues like, or spreads over into other policy domains, such as commemoration policy, think of Yasukuni, in terms of education policy, thinks of the disputes over the textbooks, in terms of compensation. If you can, you need to not just have an apology, this rhetorical step, but you need to back it up with other more concrete steps. If you're able to do that and exercise leadership between countries, then it is possible over time to actually diffuse some of these things. That may not be possible in every case. I don't think the conditions are very good between Japan and China, for example. I think Korea and Japan might be a much better place to try these things. But in any case, going back to my original point, I think we need a multi-pronged approach. And if we do that, and with China at a minimum we can contain these issues and explore these other mechanisms of confidence building measures, joint development and so forth, I think that we have a very good chance of preventing these problems from getting worse.